Wow, that was fantastic. You wouldn't hear that just in any old church service either. I think we all, can I have that a little bit more in the middle? I can handle them. I won't walk around too much. I think we all know intuitively the part that music plays in our life and helping us sort of sort through life and figure things out. But Christina, thank you for making that very apparent here today. Really sweet. I've brought you a bouquet of lilacs. They're mine.
They smell beautiful.
Don't they? And they actually belong to me. I don't have to steal them from off the side of the road or other people's yards anymore. I used to. These lilacs represent hope in a fallen world to me. Hope in a fallen world. They came off a bush in my yard that's about, I don't know, maybe 12 feet tall now. That bush grew from a very small sapling that I dug up from a lilac bush in my mom and dad's yard. About 15 years ago, I went to visit them. And as I was going to come home, I thought I should take some stuff and I should try to recreate my home in Michigan. And so I dug up just a couple little saplings and stuck them in a pot and threw them in my trunk and got back to Michigan and I planted them in the ground. And that's probably been about 15 years ago. And, you know, it kind of grew. It did grow. And it never produced flowers, and I was a little bit discouraged. And I thought, oh, maybe you can't do that. I'm not much of a farmer. Maybe you can't do that. And then last year, they kind of gave a little bit of something, and I thought, oh, maybe it's going to work. And this year, despite the crazy weather that we have, it really kind of took off. And I didn't take all of them. There's more on the bush than what I brought here. The bush that this came from no longer exists. The yard no longer exists. The house no longer exists. It was torn down quite a number of years ago. There's a very lovely business that sits in its place. My parents no longer exist. They both have passed away now. And this lilac bush, it took a long time to kind of reap any pretty smelling flowers, reminds me and is the symbol to me of what hope is in a difficult, fallen world. So when we talk today, I want you to keep in mind what that pretty vase of lilacs represents. I'm glad you're all here this morning. And my prayer is, what I've thought a lot about as I would talk to you today, is that whatever it is that your soul most longs for today, that being here today and talking today and listening today will help you find that which you seek with us together in Jesus. As we begin, I have to make a confession. I will be preaching someone else's sermon today. It's not mine. You see, our text is Matthew 5. And Matthew 5 is a sermon. In the world of biblical study, it is usually identified simply as the sermon. And when you see that, it is usually just followed by the sermon, and then it's told where the location was where it was preached. So the Sermon on the Mount, maybe you've heard of it. It's a sermon given by Jesus. It is actually probably his inaugural sermon, one that he preached very early on in his ministry, just after he had sort of grouped his disciples together. Now, I know it may seem a bit odd, but there aren't a lot of sermons attributed to Jesus in the Bible. There are many stories about Jesus healing people, and many other great little stories, what we call parables, that Jesus told. And both in his healings and in these parables, they are just packed with powerful truths and information about himself and God, but they aren't generally what we would call sermons. There's also an incredible record of precious relationships that Jesus had with his disciples and so many other people. And these relationships, too, speak volumes about what Jesus loves and what he embraces and what he holds as valuable and who he is and what his kingdom is all about. So we don't lack for information. But the truth is there is very little by way of a full-blown sermon given by Jesus and recorded in Scripture. In fact, it could be argued that this is pretty much it. Here in Matthew 5, this is the sermon. Jesus' singular signature sermon. So today I'm going to preach Jesus' sermon, literally. At least in part, because it actually covers 3 chapters. And somebody next week is going to have to pick up where we leave off. And I am just barely going to get through the beginning. So there's a lot more to hear. Okay, it probably won't surprise you that Jesus was a gifted preacher with a wonderful sense of how to share his thoughts with people. His vision of what he wants to say is crystal clear. His burden for the people that are listening literally consumes him. And his words are well chosen, poignant, and in one way or another, they always seem to penetrate to the very heart of those that are listening. And his theology, the concepts and the ideas that he bases sermons on, well, those are perfect. Absolutely perfect theology, because Jesus knows God and shares a life with him. Maybe that's why he only has one sermon. It's that good. He doesn't need another one. It's so good and so complete that it is exactly all and everything we need to have in a sermon. One great sermon by Jesus. I would invite you to open your Bibles with me today. And this sermon begins in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, as you're getting to chapter 5, I'm going to tell you that just by way of a little structure, I have divided the sermon into 3 basic sections. Just for a quick overview, I'll only deal with the introduction to the first section, but I still think that an overview of the whole thing might be helpful as we set out in this journey of Jesus' sermon. Section 1. The sermon begins with a very creative, a lot like what happened here today in church. Not your ordinary kind of special music. Jesus begins his sermon with a very creative introduction. He actually recites a poetic vision of sorts, laying out for the people God's perspective, God's expectation, God's promises, if you please, to a fallen world of people who are actually looking for a coming Messiah King to come and rescue them from all their heartache and trouble and shame. This poetic part is traditionally called the Beatitudes. This is verses 3 through 12, and we will come back to them in earnest in just a moment. The second part of the sermon is where Jesus explains how this God vision of expectation can effectively work in people and to the world around them. And he does it brilliantly within the metaphors of salt and light. It's amazing. This part can be found in chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. And finally, the last part, and by far the largest part of the sermon, is where Jesus explains this God vision, once again, for human behavior and what it would look like within the context of God's law. And just so you know, Jesus makes it clear in his sermon that he fully supports God's law. When he says in verse 17, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets," he's inclusive of Scripture. "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And from that point on, Jesus spends the rest of his time describing what God's vision for human beings should look like in everyday kinds of situations, tremendous challenges, and also personal devotion. It is an amazing and thorough, precious sermon. Now, when Jesus opens his sermon with his poem, he immediately captures the imagination and the attention of his audience. It really reads like a song or a ballad. Maybe he even sung it to them. We don't know, but I want to think yes. At any rate, it's clear that Jesus uses rhyme and rhythm along with repetition and principles of meter and cadence to deliver his first and opening remarks. We know this simply by the word structure and by how it's usually laid out on the page in most Bible translations. It was delivered as a song or a poem. That's how Jesus chooses to begin his sermon. The words are hopeful, stirring, challenging, and resonate with the people's personal experiences. They listen first because they like the format. They like the lilt and the sound of the words and the sound of his voice. But they also listen because everything Jesus says strikes a chord of familiarity, but also, at the same time, it reaches down to these deep-seated longings of their heart. They see themselves in the situations and the descriptions he references. And he frames the whole thing, within the concept of blessedness, real and sustaining happiness. The words he uses speak of happiness for the present time, but not that alone. The words he chooses hearken to the future, some kind of happiness that will endure and last forever. They pick up on his specific lingo. It's messianic, and it references a God who will deliver. And they are on board. He has their undivided attention. 9 times Jesus defines blessedness, and 9 times he claims a promised outcome that will follow each situation. But for all this happiness, there is much that the people and all of us who read the sermon in decades after, in ages after, like today, there is much that they and we too will need to learn and come to understand within the depth of this God vision for how humans can survive and even thrive while we wait in a very fallen, miserable, and often impossible world for the plan of redemption to be complete and finished. This is the key. This is the key. So let's get started. Basically, I'm just going to read down through the opening poem, and I'm going to discuss some definitions primarily as a way of helping us all better grasp the intended meaning here. You can read along. The poem actually starts in verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This term poor obviously suggests something far more than a lack of monetary means. In reality, the biblical term comes with a distinct connotation of defenselessness, destitute and without any means of any kind. It actually describes a person who must be fully dependent on somebody else. Fundamentally, to be poor in spirit is to have no options other than to simply trust in someone greater, someone with options, someone with power and means that you don't have. Blessed are the people who know they have nothing except the incredible chance to humbly hope and trust in God. Blessed are those who fully depend on me, says God. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. Verse number 1. The second verse of the song comes in verse 4. Blessed are they that mourn. And in this text, there is quite a bit more than is what readily apparent or what first meets the eye. It's all sweet and it's all good. The root word here for mourn comes from the Greek word pentheo, and it is the strongest term in all of Scripture for the concept of grieving. It certainly can include mourning for the loss of loved ones, and we can take great comfort in this, but the term is infinitely more inclusive than simply grieving over the death of someone else. This term is very personal in nature. The very same word, interesting enough, this pentheo, this mourning, is used in Revelation 18 of all places. In association with the fall of Babylon, the consummate symbol of falling away from God and being unfaithful, what is generally the symbol of what it is to be sinful and unfaithful. The text in Revelation describes onlookers. The world is difficult at times. I told you that, and we have a manifestation. The text in Revelation here describes onlookers watching the great city of Babylon burn down to utter ruin. And the text reads, "They will throw dust on their heads, and with weeping and pentheo, with weeping and mourning, cry out, 'Woe, woe, O great city.'" And we come to realize that this term, pentheo, or mourning, must be understood within the context of people who have taken stock of their sin and absolute fallenness. Who knew? And Jesus' use of this term is not lost on the people. They get it. He is referencing the grieving process of their own sin and unfaithfulness. Blessed are people who mourn every loss, and certainly the loss that comes with our own waywardness, our own sin that leads to our own eternal death is part of that. This is clearly part and parcel of the biblical use of the word to mourn. Blessed are people who recognize their sin and need of God. And the promise is, they shall be comforted. Phew. It's so much better. It's so much better when we know its fullest meaning, because now you know this beatitude belongs to all of us, whether you have experienced the traditional great loss or not. Scripture, Old and New Testament alike, tell of God's zero tolerance for sin. But the real point of Scripture is telling of God's desperate efforts and equally powerful desire and ability to forgive sin, yes? And He wants to rectify sinners. This is what Jesus is underscoring in this beatitude. Blessed are people who grieve their sins and mistakes. This is the way to forgiveness, and they will be comforted. You won't always suffer under the weight of sin. I love that. When I figured that out, I was happy about the mourning process. Verse 5, blessed are the meek. Now here, the term meek stems from the Greek word praus. And it is the same word that one would use if they were talking about how that a horse can be trained to follow reins. I don't know if you like being in the company of horse training. you being the horse, but that's a good definition of this word for meek. Basically, it means teachable. And here again, it includes those who are humble and trusting and won't allow self to get in the way of what God can and longs to do in their lives. How happy, Jesus says, are humble, trusting, teachable people. They are the happy ones, and they are the kinds of people that will inherit the earth. Now, the people listening, they like it, but it doesn't necessarily make sense. Because in their life situation, and likely in yours too, it seems a whole lot more like you have to be a little ruthless sometimes, a little self-promoting sometimes, and a little like you need to prove yourself a bit better than the next guy so that you can get ahead in this world. But it won't always be this way, Jesus says. In my kingdom, in God's vision of the world, it is the meek and the trusting and the teachable, not the know-it-alls, that will rule the earth. That's the standard God loves and will honor. Jesus says, "Blessed are people who trust me and are teachable. They shall inherit the earth." Verse 6. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness." This statement seems completely self-evident to me. Of course, it is right to want righteousness. I think the reason that Jesus includes it here in his poem is not because it is so mind-blowing in concept, but rather because it is so overwhelmingly absent in the human experience. We don't hunger and thirst after righteousness. Not enough. Not the way Jesus is talking about. Jesus uses a word for hunger here that is much closer to our word for famine. This is no ordinary hunger he's talking about. It isn't merely some hankering for a spiritual snack on Saturday morning. This is a desperate search for something you know you need. This is an overwhelming desire for fulfillment in Christ, and it involves seeking something that is not readily found. Remember, it's a famine he's talking about. We are famished and searching for spiritual truth. "You will find me when you seek me with all your heart," says God. Blessed are people, happy are people who are desperate for spiritual understanding and fulfillment. They will be filled. There's a promise. Now, these first 4 Beatitudes speak of our need for and our relationship with God clearly. Jesus lays out the parameters of how we seek God and find true and lasting happiness in and with him as human beings here on earth while waiting for the redemption of the world. That's the focus of the first 4 stanzas of his song. And then Jesus turns his attention to how we interact with one another. And the next 3 Beatitudes, verses 7, 8, and 9, are concerned with God's vision for human relationships, our earthly relationships with one another. So let's keep reading. That starts in verse 7 of Matthew 5, when he says, "Blessed are the merciful." Any online dictionary can confirm the definition of this word. What's merciful mean? What's that? Showing mercy, of course. And that concept, when we're merciful, we actively show mercy. What's mercy? Anybody know? Anybody want it? So it must be good, because I think I want it. Forgiveness, grace, kindness, long-suffering, compassion almost always comes up if you look it up in a dictionary. Cutting people slack, real slack, extending forbearance on all of our shortcomings, that's mercy. Blessed are truly loving people who treat others with grace and patience and genuine respect. That's how God will treat them. Mercy begets mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Kinda duh, kinda good. How we're supposed to behave with one another. Verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart. Now, purity is a particularly interesting word in Scripture. And it carries a connotation of something belonging to the words clean or light or transparency. Something that is without corruptive motives or intentions. Blessed people are people who have nothing to hide or be ashamed of. Blessed are people who are honest in their dealings and trustworthy with one another. Blessed are people who you could look straight through. I know this is a bit intimidating. You could look straight through, and both you and they would feel comfortable in one another's presence. It's a high calling, this purity of heart, to be sure. But it is exactly what Jesus is talking about, and it is his expectation. And Jesus is very clear on this point about internal purity. It's the heart that concerns him. He will often remind them, though you look at the outside of a person, I look at the inside. I look at the heart, because that's where the truth actually lies. What is inside is what matters to me. And the promised outcome in this particular beatitude is not so apparent unless you know that in Scripture, seeing God and worship are often used interchangeably. So, Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And inherent in this promise is the act of worship itself. They will come before God's throne and worship him. Blessed are the pure in heart. They will come before God's throne and worship him. Now, Jesus knows at the time that he gives this sermon, he is well aware of the traditions of the day. That is, that outward problems that we can see, disease, sores, disfigurements, physical disabilities, these were all assumed to be the direct result of specific sin. And so, if you had a cold sore or a withered hand, say nothing of like leprosy or endless hemorrhaging, it was obvious that you were spiritually impure and you were summarily excluded from the temple and worship services. That's the way it was done. Truth. And he tells the people who know this, that's their custom, stop looking at the outside. Stop thinking you have people figured out. And most of all, stop denying people access to God. I see what you don't see. I see what you can't see. It's the heart that matters to Christ. And with this reversal of criteria that he sets up, a whole new world opens up for all the less than perfect people in the world. Because now they too have access to God. Now they too can come before his throne and worship. This beatitude is mind-blowing to the current culture. And frankly, I think we still struggle with it today. It sounded good in theory. But now, how will they be able to tell who's good and who's bad anymore? Everybody's coming before the throne of God if they want to talk to God and worship him. Maybe it's not their job. Maybe that's not our job. Worry about the pureness in your own heart, says Jesus, and the rest of this stuff kind of falls beautifully into place. Happy, happy are the pure in heart. They get to worship me, and I alone know the heart. I love that one. I love this song. Verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers. This injunction also appears rather self-evident. And it is. Happy are people that don't fight and fume. It is an empirical statement, if you please. Happiness and fighting can't live in the same space. And Jesus will explore this whole idea in far greater depth a little further on in his sermon, when he talks about loving your enemies and the unlovable, and even absorbing evil with the turning of your cheek. The expectation is huge here, but for now he's just introducing the idea in his opening song. All the same, when Jesus tells these folks to be peacemakers, it implies very intentional work. And for many, that old proverb comes to mind, the one that says we need to be kind and caring to our enemies, making peace. And in doing so, it'll be like heaping burning coals on their heads. Remember that one? Proverbs 25. They know that proverb. Now let's be clear. It isn't real coals. That would not be consistent with everything else that Jesus is saying. You don't put real hot coals on somebody's head. But it is an incredible metaphor. These coals represent real effort. They are symbolic of warmth. Warmth that can rekindle a legitimate fire of goodness in your enemy's head, in their mind. You are stirring the coals of better things in their minds, in their heads. The proverb writer Solomon is simply suggesting that when we are kind, genuinely kind, we remind people of what kindness looks like and what kindness feels like. And we stir those old embers of kindness and goodness in their own head that have all but almost gone. This heaping coal thing is actually a very hopeful and proactive proposal for peace. Peacemaking is very intentional. It is something you work to create. And when we live as peacemakers, we behave like God's children. The verse says, happy and blessed are people who intentionally and doggedly work for love and peace. God will claim them as his very own children. So far, so good. Really. All in all, the message of this introductory song is motivating, inspiring, and wonderfully hopeful. Certainly, people know that they will have to step up to the plate, but it seems completely worth it. They have now been promised a kingdom, forgiveness and comfort, a glorious inheritance, attained righteousness, mercy, freedom to worship, and a kinship with God as his own children. They're ready to do anything for that. I would agree. And then Jesus sings the final stanza, verses 10 through 12. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for doing the right thing. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and say awful and terrible lies about you because of me, because you know and follow me. When this happens, rejoice and be glad. I think I can pretty well guess how most of us feel when we read that last stanza. Why? Why that stanza? This is hard for all of us, and it was truly hard for the downtrodden people that heard it that day. Everything had been going so great. Jesus was looking very much like the Messiah they had all been waiting for. But this is not how the song should end. This is not what they wanted to hear. They're already persecuted for crying out loud. Jesus, the Messiah, is supposed to come and rescue them from all of that. The folks sitting on the hill that day were already poor, sick, hungry, underprivileged, and underappreciated. In fact, as crazy as it sounds, that's probably almost the worst part for them, that being underappreciated. They don't feel loved. They don't feel supported. They don't feel understood and cared about by anybody. They live under foreign rule, and even among themselves, they have somehow allowed a value system to develop that distinguishes between the worthy and the less worthy, the haves and the have-nots. That may be the way it always is, but they feel it, and it hurts. They were so hopeful until Jesus sang that last verse about being blessed when we're persecuted. I want to suggest to you that this is the real challenge of living in a fallen world and trying to hang on and maintain some kind of honest hope in Jesus. Because things are still difficult sometimes, very difficult, and much too often. Jesus knows the last stanza lacks appeal, but he's too honest to tell them anything else but the truth. We're in a battle here. Presently, evil rules the world. And the devil is trying his best and will do absolutely anything he can to stop God's plan of redemption to see through to its fruition. Until it is completely over, there will be plenty of heartache still, way too much sorrow, and sometimes you will suffer for doing the right thing, and sometimes you will suffer for following your conscience, and sometimes you will suffer for standing up for Jesus. And he says, stay happy, be humble, take stock of your condition, be meek, hunger like crazy after me, be kind, be pure in your own heart and worship me, create peace wherever you can. These ways of living will see you through, and just trust me. Actually, rejoice and be glad in me. The prophets before you went through the same thing. And I promise you, says Jesus, everything Everything, including the continued heartache, will be more than worth it. Your reward will be great, greater than I can even explain to you, greater than you can even imagine. Just please hang on and trust me. It's no different for us today. My lilacs bloomed. This is what I know about me. I don't know about you. When push comes to shove, I don't want to be the person. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have picked the flowers. When push comes to shove, I don't want to be the person that gives up on hope. I don't want to be that person. So I choose hope. I choose Jesus. Let's pray. Father, you are so precious to send us your Son, Christ. And he was so precious to sing a song to the people that kind of encompassed the whole deal. And then he carefully delineated it all for them to understand and hear. I simply pray today that we will better understand you. We will go through the song and we will attempt in your power and with your spirit to follow through on every one and end and land on hope in Jesus. To that end I pray in his name, in the name of Jesus. Amen. God bless you guys.